Hello friend, today's video is my full conversation with Jason Krupa. I would recommend watching my previous video on Jason for context regarding his reconstruction work. I will drop that link in the description below. Jason Krupa is a photographer, music historian, and forensic audiophile who reconstructs old or unreleased film and television scores as a hobby. He co-wrote a book on the Beatles titled All Things Must Pass Away: Harrison, Clapton, and Other Assorted Love Songs. His podcast, Producing the Beatles, the Podcast, is a fascinating narrative journey from the perspective of the Beatles producer, George Martin. You can find his score reconstructions on YouTube on his personal channel. Check out the links in the description to start listening and reading. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Jason Krupa. How did you get exposed to the Incubus soundtrack in the first place?
Well, watching the film, which I'd heard about for years, and then finally decided to sit down and watch it, and in the course of that, realizing, what's this strange soundtrack? And I'd seen all the old Outer Limits episodes years ago, and sort of rang a faint bell. And I started digging, and I was, realized that all the music had been tracked in from Outer Limits, and nobody really knew what pieces were. And I just sort of thought, like, well, I want to figure out some of these sounds. I want to see how the composer did this, and that led to reconstructing one cue. And then I thought, well, I want to do these other ones. Let's, I'll do the rest. And before I knew it, I was into reconstructing the whole thing from the Outer Limits cues and seeing, and that has become a big, ridiculous puzzle. And as I've mentioned, sort of. As a means of understanding how film music fits to the film, and part of my intuitive, totally making up as I go method of teaching myself orchestration and scoring, because I'm doing a little work for independent films, and writing music and that kind of thing. So that's really how all that began. And it like any crazy project, you just sort of, this is my experience. When I get into a project that sort of really occupies my imagination, and I think I have to figure out how this was done or why this was done, it becomes a project with a capital P. And that's really all I can say as far as discovering the music. Getting into the process of putting it together is a whole other thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So why is the Incubus soundtrack unique? What makes it different from other soundtracks that you probably hear in this era, but just kind of in general?
Well, in general, it's tracked in from Outer Limits episodes. So it was already composed. Dominic Frontiere is their composer, and he was listed as a producer on this. He's part of Daystar Productions with the producer of Outer Limits and of this film.
Yeah.
And so his music, he did apparently write a little original music for this, but 90% of it, probably maybe more, is taken from the Outer Limits episodes and chopped up and rearranged and overlaid and stitched together into this kind of Frankenstein's monster of a soundtrack. And it's really interesting. The music, as you hear it in Outer Limits, has a very specific effect, and it's sort of this sort of hyper dramatic, for an hour-long TV show in 64, 65, 63, 64, 65, whenever it aired. It's hyper dramatic. It's very over the top, and especially looking at it now, these sort of interesting ideas paired with whatever they could do with special effects and technology at the time, it really heightens that effect. And in Incubus, the effect it's different. It's not, I wouldn't say it's dramatically different, but given the visuals, and this is a unique situation. There may be others like this in film history, I'm not sure, but it's sort of a unique look at how music can change the overall effect once you put it in a different context. So you put it with Outer Limits, and it's got a particular context, but you put it with this Esperanto film shot in black and white, um, you know, partly in Malibu, I think. Um, I've jokingly called it Ingmar Bergman's The Outer Limits because it really has this kind of otherworldly feeling, a sense of being in a different place because of the Esperanto, and so it I think it combines to create this different effect given those visuals and given the way it's sort of put together um, into these cues, which were not the way they were assembled in Outer Limits at all.
Yeah. How much input do you think Frontieri had? And I guess this is mostly speculation, but maybe but like how much input did he have over sort of the remixing process? Do you have any idea?
I mean, I would imagine he, directed that process. He's working with Joseph Caper, who was an audio uh, editor, music editor in film. And he has a long list of credits on IMDb.
Yeah.
And for what he did, just having as an editor at that time to work strictly with tape. I can put things up on it in a DAW now and work much more easily. But he's taking these pieces and in some cases duplicating them and overlaying them and really creating a new thing using just tape. So I would imagine Frontieri directed this, saying, I don't know if John Caper read music, but Frontieri would have said, okay, well, this part of the score can work for this scene. And I imagine the what they call the spotting session at the time would have been very interesting because he would have known the music intimately, obviously, and specifically from 2 episodes and from a couple of others, smaller pieces. Yep. And he would have known, what might work where for a particular effect, whether it's sort of atmosphere in the background or whether it's an orchestral sting where it's you sort of like big dramatic moment. And obviously on TV you have commercial breaks, so you're working toward building dynamic tension to that, and then building to a climax maybe before this before the break. So in a film you don't have that. So he's repurposing his music and seeing how it's going to fit in different ways. In a feature film is obviously much different in terms of structure and where the beats are than 60-minute television show. So I would imagine he had a tremendous amount of input as far as where the music was used and how he sort of wanted that music to be edited.
Sure. So I had always assumed, I mean, I say always, but I had previously assumed that the reason why John Caper Jr., and you called him Joseph, is it Joseph or John?
I'm sorry, it's John. Yes.
Oh, okay. No, you're good. You're good. I'm just making sure I didn't put it wrong on my previous video.
Yeah.
So I assumed he was kind of taking over because maybe Frontieri wasn't available to do the scoring and the orchestration, but it sounds like he was probably present. So I wonder kind of what the money save is, because it's a choice to save some cash while they were strapped for cash. Daystar was. So I wonder. So I guess the presumption then could be that they're saving money on the orchestra themselves. Is that probably where the money's being saved at?
I would imagine. I mean, this is all speculation. I don't have any,
of course,
information about this.
Yeah.
Although Frontieri's papers are in the University of Wyoming, and there is a crazy gremlin living in me that's like, oh, well, what are plane flights to Wyoming like? And where can I stay?
Yeah.
Because, but I mean, obviously way over and beyond any, I'm not getting paid for this. This is just strictly out of my own curiosity.
Oh, for sure.
But it's
you're a madman, Jason. Madman.
Yes.
Totally.
And anybody who's gone down a rabbit hole like this is like, well, I must know more. Like, is there, something's written down? I must go find these things that are written down. I think, that's sort of the historian and researcher's life story.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to overturn every possible thing that I can. So, like I said, speculation, but I would imagine you're saving on orchestra cost, you're saving on, whatever he would have been paid to actually compose music. He would have been paid a licensing fee to use the music.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And any, I don't know all the ins and outs of of publishing and all the mechanicals and all that. But he apparently did write like a few short pieces that I haven't been able to find in the Outer Limits music. So I'm imagining those must be the pieces that he wrote. It's not much. It's maybe 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, real short.
It could be longer. I could be wrong about that, but he may have re-recorded a few things because there are a couple of cues that I've noticed. Really, they sound like something that he recorded for Outer Limits, but they're different. Maybe the arrangement's a little bit different, or it's played in a slightly different way. And when we get into like crazy nuance with something like this, which no one in their right mind would care about, by the way. I fully admit that I'm not in my right mind.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
But in reconstructing this process and sort of understanding, what they might have done in this very strange and unique situation, that's my best guess, is that they saved money on, orchestra and whatever they would have paid him to compose.
That makes sense. What would you call this kind of music? So I'm not terribly familiar with this era of television. I watched a lot of Star Trek, the original series, The Twilight Zone, and The Outer Limits, and they all kind of have that same sort of sound. Does that sound have like a name? Is that kind of a genre of scoring? What would you call that?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
I will say, just in general about the arrangements, they're very unusual. If you look at, I've been looking into Bernard Herrmann's work in Twilight Zone, and even his work, early work at that time, we'd sort of know him for strings. We know him for Psycho. We know him for Vertigo. These are string heavy scores.
Yeah.
And he certainly does use strings in like his Twilight Zone scores. But there's, one in particular, which we were talking about earlier, there are no strings, and he's using trumpets, and he's using vibraphone, and he's using Hammond organ, and trombones, beaded trombones and trumpets. So that's a digression, a way of saying that, this unusual arrangement for Outer Limits for these episodes, it's like harp and electric guitar, electric bass.
Yeah.
An instrument called an onifets, which is it's an early, it's sort of a proto synthesizer. So the way I understand it from just what I've read online, no original research here, just anybody can find this.
Right.
But onifets is Stefano spelled backwards. Joseph Stefano was the producer, and it was operated by means of what someone described as like a giant time clock. So you would turn the knob or whatever you use to the pitch that's marked on the dial, and that would give you roughly what your note is. But no idea how this thing was constructed. I've posted things on Reddit and said, does anybody know what this is? What does it sound like? And people have given some pretty good guesses. I've talked to a composer I know who's really into 60s sounds, and we bounced it around a lot to try to figure it out. And so that in itself really sets this score apart, because it's taken from an episode called The Nightmare and another episode called The Mice. Primarily, those are where that sound occurs. So it's a really unusual sounding score. Like the instruments used are not sort of what you would expect to hear in a dramatic score. Although for science fiction, it does make sense, because you've got these sort of strange otherworldly sounds. He's using flutes and he's using piccolos, and but he's using them in sort of odd ways too. Yep. with the onifets, and even accordion in a couple of places. So it's just like, it's so strange. And having watched a lot of stuff, like science fiction shows in the late 50s, early 60s, the instrumentation would be very unusual to sort of create this otherworldly sense. Some of it would could be maybe vibraphone and harp and glockenspiel, which will create a particular type of Bernard Herrmann used this certainly, and you hear it in Star Trek as well, where you get this sort of like twinkly outer space feel, which at the
Yeah.
time is, I think it's sort of like outer space music in television in the 50s and 60s, late 50s, early 60s, sort of veered toward that. Like that was that's kind of the sound world, when they want to evoke something otherworldly and strange, is to go for these unusual instruments, unusual instrumentation.
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and whenever I listen to the original Star Trek soundtrack, I think of the ladies that are singing in the background.
Yeah,
I'm keeping myself from making that particular sound because it'd be terrible. But it comes to mind immediately. It's like that, and then the vibraphone is certainly one that I can always pick out, and I always am very thankful to hear because it's like, this feels like home. This feels like I've made it back home.
yeah. Well, there's also I had to recreate some Star Trek style music for this film that I'm working on,
Yeah.
and it, there are things like it's not a Moog synthesizer, but it's sort of in that kind of sound world where they're making these what's called Mobius blips is what I've seen them called.
Okay.
Uh, and you'll hear that in Star Trek. These sort of the thing that I associate with is the um, the heart monitor in sick bay. That
Oh
kind of
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
pulsing. Yeah,
Hmm.
but you hear it in other places in that score, along with female voices, along with um, all manner of things employed in those scores, which again is sort of in that same sound world as Twilight Zone and Outer Limits, and
Yeah.
whatever other shows were sort of um, in that vein, in that science fiction um, kind of spooky vein.
Yeah, definitely. So what got you hooked? So you got started with this, you found a puzzle and you couldn't leave it alone. So how is it that you got hooked on it? Why are you continuing to do this?
I mean, I like to know how things are done. That's sort of the whole learning to write music for film and orchestrate and how to combine these sounds. Um, was just a friend of mine started making movies, and I said, well, I'll write some music for him, and that has become to like I'm writing the entire score for this new film, which is an incredible learning experience. And in doing that, I'm
Yeah,
using
totally.
using my appreciation for like Bernard Herrmann and Jerry Goldsmith and people like that to sort of dig back and see. And fortunately, some of these scores are available to us, whether online or published in manuscript form, um, or in printed form, engraved. So it is possible to actually study what they wrote rather than by ear pick these things out and say, okay, I wonder what okay, let me see if I can recreate that. Because I'm not a trained musician. I'm just sort of figuring this stuff out
Sure.
at the keyboard, really.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it grew out of that, this sort of interest in soundtracks and how music is used in film. And I a few years ago I did the Blade Runner score the same way. I was able to reconstruct that from as it was used in the film, from a lot of basically unofficial sources, um, and extracting music from the rear Blu-ray channels of all places. Just so again, a puzzle. And I'd always loved the music for that film. I loved that film since it came out. So um, I kind of wanted to do that for my own curiosity. And I shared it with various groups, Blade Runner groups, and Vangelis, the composer, fan groups. And so thousands of people have listened to this crazy project that I
Yeah.
did. And um, but it was rewarding to do it and say, okay, I figured this out. I figured out the puzzle. I don't expect nearly as much of response to Incubus because nobody knows it, and I don't really
Yes.
think that many people care. But it was one of those things where it's like I'm trying to figure out these sounds anyway. Why don't I dig into this and see what I can learn?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I'm not doing it with any urgency. It's just when I think of it and I have time, and I think I am about 70% done. But it's that last 30% where I'm just sort of like, when will I find the time to do this? And
Yeah. Sure.
um, but I will finish it eventually.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's amazing. Um, so let's get into the technical stuff. Let's dive into this. So, um, you've already kind of mentioned it before, but you have used in the past, and I don't think it's specifically for Incubus, but for Blade Runner, you've had sort of like this online network of people. So you use kind of like forums, you use different resources from people who are already interested in this subject, sort of like you are, and then you can kind of bring stuff together. You want to talk about that for just a second?
Yeah, I mean, Blade Runner was much more the case of other people had made sort of fan compilations, and they'd been collecting these, bootlegs for 20 years probably.
Right. Yeah.
And so they had a head start on me, and I mentioned to one of them, I said, I'm thinking about doing this, and as it's used in the film. And he said, "Oh, I think it's a great idea. I think it really needs to be done." And so he sent me a lot of material, and then someone else sent me a lot of material that he had sort of been, just as a collector, he had put together. And he said, "Oh, I think you might find something in here." And beyond that, it was just sort of like figured out. There was really no guide to say, how this was done. And so in the course of that, I really learned a lot about, in that particular case, how the music was fit to the film. And I think the editor, Terry Rawlings, really had a lot to do with that, because he was a big music fan. And, he did similar things on Alien, where he took previously existing cues by Jerry Goldsmith and used them in the finished film, much to Goldsmith's dismay, a long time dismay. But so, in doing that, I learned a lot about that process. And again, just sort of looking at how, music can be taken and say, okay, we've got this piece of music, let's reuse this in this scene. And this will sort of tie threads together in the narrative, in the sort of background. And so, in that case, it's different in that, there was a network of people who had been sort of looking into this. With Outer Limits and with Incubus, there's probably a pretty small but loyal, fervent fan base of people who are interested in Outer Limits music, and in particular these two scores, because they are so strange. I can't imagine there are more than like 10 people who care about Incubus, like the music and how it was put together. And,
yeah. And you and I are two of them. So there's like 8 other people somewhere. Yeah.
8 other people somewhere in the world. So, it's a thing that I want to figure out as, part of, like I said, teaching myself scoring. And I may try to reproduce a couple of these through sample libraries. These pieces, because they're so unusual and because they have such an interesting sound, just as sort of a way, any painter, any composer, any songwriter, anything, any artist, I think if they're honest, will begin copying someone else's work, and just to see how it makes it tick. I've talked to lots of
absolutely
lots of jazz players who will copy solos of their favorite performers or composers, and I know someone at Berklee School of Music, so I know I don't know if the school does it, but he has definitely transcribed solos and learned to play the solos as a way of teaching himself, like immersing himself in that thought process.
Yeah.
So that's my sort of intention, is immersing myself in this thought process and understanding how this is done, whether it's how the arrangements are done or how a particular sound is created.
Sweet. So let's say you're diving into a track in Incubus. Let's say it's a track you haven't done yet. You open it up, you listen to the track, and then what's the next step in the process of reconstruction?
Well, it was a matter of first going through the entire film and marking where the music was. So pulling the audio track out and then, marking, I think I have 37 cues. I forget exactly how many, but that's what I found. But those cues are sometimes composed of 3 or 4, and there's 1 or 2 that are actually 8 pieces of music taken from Outer Limits music. So it requires going to the Outer Limits music and finding those pieces, sort of labeling them. And I have a document that has everything laid out. So it's like Q1 is this and this and this and this, and how many seconds of this, and then we repeat this, section. So first it was a matter of doing that, and then as I go through each section, I pull those pieces out and then I put them together in I use Adobe Audition to mix, just because I've used it for so long and
Sure.
very familiar with it. And for this, it it works pretty well. And then I drop those pieces in, and then sort of make it so they flow together. They feel natural, because in editing with music to film, you don't always have to make it sound like it flows. It's supposed to fit the picture. So, it can be buried behind dialogue and sound effects. And so sometimes those transitions are kind of rough. And, so I'm creating it. So it's like, okay, we're listening to this. It's pretty close to what's in the film, but it's more to sort of like see how these pieces fit together.
Yeah.
And in some cases, they really don't fit together well. It's a very abrupt, shift. But yeah, so that's the process, is finding where the music is, identifying it in the Outer Limits music, and then piecing it together. And the identifying part is the hardest, because some of these pieces can sound very similar. Some of them, there are two that I know I swear I've heard, and I just can't find them.
Yeah.
And so I think it's that he's written something similar and he's recorded a new piece in that style, or in that sort of general feel.
Yeah.
And so that's why it sounds so familiar.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So it's I hope that answers your question as far as the process for
Absolutely. Yeah.
Putting one of these cues together.
Yeah. It's total madness. You're a madman. So
I agree. I 100%.
No, but I love it. It's awesome. So you mentioned before, when we last had a discussion, that you used AI tools for certain projects, for this reconstruction process. Do you do that for Incubus, or is that something that you've used in like Blade Runner or something else? What is that particularly?
I didn't use it in Blade Runner so much. I did edit one track, spectral editing, which is probably way too complicated to go into, and I don't really understand how it works, but I kind of know what to do to make it work a little bit.
Okay, sure.
Where you can basically go in and color out certain frequencies, or certain that appear in the spectral view of the track.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I'm tracking with you.
Right. But as far as AI, in the last few years, a lot of tools have popped up that allow separation of voices, and mostly voices and instrument, but in some cases drums are pretty well identifiable, so percussion can be taken out or isolated. So I have used that to remove percussion from certain things, because I think he remixed certain cues, and say removed the drums and just left the flutes, or left the flutes and the harps. Or
interesting. Yeah.
So
Whoa.
somebody had access to the multi-tracks. If I'm imagining this was recorded on 3 or 4 track tape, so to sort of be able to go in and create that sound, I've used AI to sort of separate, to extract certain instruments where possible. It's not always possible. We're not quite there yet.
Sure.
But it is a huge leap. Anybody
Absolutely.
interested in looking into AI, demixing tools. The Beatles used Peter Jackson's techniques recently to great effect. So, this is sort of the consumer grade version of that isn't trained on specific models. It's sort of trained generically on models. So, it's exciting to be able to use this stuff, just on a little goofy project like this, where I don't have access to the original tapes, and I'm just kind of making it up as I go.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, totally. It's a huge mess, and you're sorting it out. I was talking to a buddy of mine about your project, and he said, how did he describe you? He described you as a forensic audiophile, which I thought was very funny. I think that actually works pretty well.
No, it is definitely forensics. It's really like literally going to a surgical level, and but also reconstructing the crime. Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
you know,
totally.
where there's no documentation available sort of easily publicly. Um, and this is, and maybe there's some part of my brain that wants to work in some sort of forensics. It would fit in that. But I agree. I mean, I think that's a forensics is a really good description.
So how long does it take you to do an Incubus track? Like if you're going to do a reconstruction of one particular track, one, I guess it wouldn't be a cue. Would you call it a cue if it's an Incubus? I'm not entirely sure what the definition of cue is. I usually associate with television. Is it same for film?
Yeah, it's a cue is just any piece of music that's fit to a scene. I mean, this is not maybe the
Okay.
dictionary definition. This is as I understand it. A
Sure.
cue is a piece of film music, film or television music. Yeah, so they're cues. What in Incubus they're composed of multiple cues from Outer Limits. And as far as time, it takes a lot of time to identify the pieces. Obviously, that's the most time consuming thing.
Yeah.
Once I have the pieces and I've sort of like chopped them up and made separate files for each of them, then it's really just a matter of dropping them into the DAW and mixing them so that the levels are correct and the transitions are fairly smooth. And if I need to sort of make something, the decay of something last by adding a little bit of subtle reverb, I'll do that. If it's something where it's like two or three pieces, then it won't take very long at all, maybe an hour.
Sure.
But in the case of something that's got 8 pieces, that could take much longer. And you have to be reasonable about anything like this, where it's just sort of a crazy project. Where, and I'm not always good about this, where I start and I say, okay, I've reached a stopping point. There's only so much I can do, and I need to come back to this another time. So, if it's going to take 8 hours, I'm not going to spend 8 straight hours
Yeah.
working. I'll do maybe an hour or a half hour, and then come back later, which could be the next day, could be the next week. I haven't actually looked at this in weeks because I've had so much other work to do. So it really varies. It really depends on how complex the cue in Incubus is. Whether it's 2 or 3 pieces or whether it's 8 pieces, and depending on how all those pieces fit together as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, before we move on, I want to make it exceptionally clear to the audience, because when I first, sort of jumped into this with you and we started talking about this, I had presumed that there was some sort of like magic thing you were doing for this reconstruction. I presumed that you had like dug up this archive of music that you've been, kind of fitting it together using some sort of algorithm or something. I didn't realize until we started talking that what you're doing, again, the word forensics is super helpful here. Like you're just listening to it, you're recreating the sounds, or you're finding the sounds inside of the Outer Limits episodes. And you're just smashing it all together. Like it is such a time consuming and like so minuscule focus. Like you're laser focused on this in order to get it done. And it's just mind blowing to me. Like I can't even, it's almost, I mean, to me, it's more impressive that you're doing it just the old fashioned way of listening to it and then just kind of working it out, as opposed to just like plugging it into an algorithm and saying, hey, make this sound better, and then fixing it, which is what I presumed. And it's really incredible, man. I mean, it really is.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, it is, there have been times where I'm listening through an Outer Limits episode, for instance, looking for a piece of music, and it's like just incredibly tedious. Just and I have to take the headphones off and walk away from the computer and just say, I can't figure this out tonight. I'm gonna have to come back. I have to come back to another time, because it is really intense. Like if you've listened to the music, and hopefully people who are listening to this maybe have some familiarity with it.
Yeah.
To be able to listen and hear something that's maybe 30 seconds long and say, okay, where did this come from? And then go to an episode which may have 10, 15 minutes of music in it, and find that little piece of composition I mean, it's ridiculous. No sane person would do this, especially not for money. Like,
Yeah, no, for
just,
sure.
just not, no one's paying me. No one's called me and said, "Hey, I'd really like if you do this." No, it's just, so I appreciate that you appreciate the work that goes into it.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And let's talk about why you are doing this. Like, why is this important to you? Why do you continue to put yourself through this? If you're not being, if you're not being paid for it, if, probably with Incubus, you're not going to get a huge viewing, although I hope with this video and then, some other stuff, as you're releasing these, maybe someone will pick it up and will be excited about it too. But like, why, like, what is it that keeps you coming back to this particular project?
I mean, the real answer to that probably is something to take up with my therapist, but uh, I mean, because it is how my brain works, and I like puzzles. I like to, you know, for in various ways to figure out how things are done.
Yep.
It's you know if you if you wanted to build a trap to catch Jason Krupa, you'd probably just leave some complex puzzle under a box with a stick holding it, and you got me.
Oh,
So that's I mean there is that intellectual curiosity, I think, that draws me to something like this, and it became a project without my intending for it to be a project. It was something I was looking to out of curiosity, and I went, oh man, this is ridiculous. There's no way I want to do this. And then it kept like nagging at me, and I thought, well, I'll go back and I'll do like the opening titles, right?
yeah.
And once I did that, which was, again, very, very complicated, I did the next one, and that was easy. And I thought, oh, okay, well, maybe I can do more of these. And then I just said, okay, well, I'll do the whole thing. And I went through the entire film and blocked everything out. And because I thought, okay, if I'm going to do this, I'm just going to do this.
Yeah.
And marking the music isn't that difficult. It's just going through and listening and putting markers in to the audio file, and seeing where everything is. So then it's like, okay, I have a map of where all this stuff is. And so it is that sort of problem solving. Yeah, I'm a photographer, so one of the main things that I do is solve problems. People think it's using a camera. It's really solving problems.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think any kind of, especially commercial creative work, you're solving problems for clients. People are asking you. I just did a portrait in the cathedral here, so it's walking into that setting that I've never been into before, in a space that hardly anybody ever goes to, and figuring out, like, okay, how am I going to solve this problem? How am I going to light this? How am I going to set this up? What angles am I going to use to do this? So that's a lot of my career, is solving problems. And so, in a broad sense, I think I like solving problems. I like to have problems that I can sort of work through. That's very satisfying to me, to be able, just on a personal level, to be able to have a puzzle and say, okay, I've solved it. And again, you said maybe a small handful of people will be interested in this, and that's not really the reason I'm doing it. I don't do personal projects because I want an audience to pay attention to it. The Blade Runner thing is different, because there is a large fan base for the film and for the composer. I didn't do it with that in mind, but it was sort of a nice outcome that a lot of people have been able to enjoy that. This is again, part of a very strange, admittedly strange and intuitive way of sort of learning about film music, and and also at the same time solving the puzzle.
Yeah. And let's talk about the value of having these sort of personal projects that you do for yourself, as opposed for monetary gain or for publicity. And you've already mentioned it, like, it's a good way to practice. It's a good way to sort of learn your craft, is you take something that you are interested in or you admire, and then you just kind of work it backwards. You deconstruct it. And in your case, you're not only deconstructing, but you're also reconstructing these scores.
I mean, yeah, the value of personal projects, I think anybody in any creative field will probably tell you this, is you do it to practice your craft. You do it to experiment with new techniques and ideas that, maybe a client's not necessarily going to pay you to do, but you have an idea and you want to work it out. And, maybe a client sees that and says, "Oh, would you do that for us?" Or you learn something in that process that you can then apply to a work project, or or it just makes you better at what you do. Having as a photographer, having done shoots where I just think I have an idea for how I want to light something, I'm just going to get somebody and figure that out. Has made me a better photographer, in that I can walk into most situations with a single light and figure out how to make it work.
Yeah.
So, to me, it's the values that everything is feeding into the same, reservoir, right? Same brain. So any project you do is going to enrich your experience, enrich your knowledge base. This is music. This is a very specific thing in terms of editing and reconstructing. But I think again, it's all feeding into, who I am, my memory, my thought process, how I approach things. I don't know if it'll necessarily play into photography, but it could play into composition, and it could play into, how things are structured.
Sure. Yeah.
So, I'm still I will always be curious about how to tell a story in an unusual and different way, whether it's visually, whether it's musically, whether it's a combination of the two. So, to me, that's the value in doing projects like this is, all of those things that I just mentioned. I mean, I didn't really make a list, but, I think what I mentioned sort of just covers, why anybody creative would want to do a personal project.
Let me do a little thingamabob for you. This is, I guess you'd call this it's not an introduction because it's the end. So it's a outroduction. I don't know.
Sure.
Whatever the hell it is. All right, this is Jason Krupa. Jason Krupa is a photographer and a music historian who occasionally reconstructs old or unreleased film and television scores as a hobby. He co-wrote a book on the Beatles titled All Things Must Pass Away, Harrison, Clapton, and other assorted love songs. His podcast, Producing the Beatles, the podcast, is a fascinating narrative journey from the perspective of the Beatles producer, George Martin, and I can't recommend it enough. You can find his score reconstructions on YouTube on his personal channel. Check out the links in the description to start listening and reading. Jason Krupa, it's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to talk about this stuff.